Hey guys, welcome to the Sleepless Explainer. If you've ever found yourself lying awake at night thinking about strange questions, impossible choices or paradoxes that seem to bend reality, then you're in the right place. This space is about slowing down, listening, and letting those ideas sink in deeply, the kind that make you question what you know and wonder about what you don't. Before we start, take a second and comment where you're from. It's always incredible to see how far this little corner of the world reaches. And if you genuinely enjoy what we do here, consider liking the video and maybe subscribing. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. Time is something you live inside every day without thinking too much about it. It feels like a path you're walking along, one step at a time, with no way of turning around. The morning comes, then the afternoon, then the evening, and each moment slides into the next until it becomes memory. The past feels untouchable, the future unknown, and the present is the only place you truly stand. Yet for as long as people have been able to wonder, they have asked themselves if this path could be travelled differently. What if you could step away from the forward march? What if you could turn around and walk into yesterday? The thought is simple at first, almost like imagining an old photograph come to life, but it grows quickly into something more difficult, something that unsettles the way we understand existence. To travel back in time is to do more than watch. It is to touch the fragile web of causes and effects that gave birth to the present moment. Think of it gently, not as a machine whirring with energy, but as a door that quietly opens. Behind it are moments you know well, an old conversation, a place you once stood, a voice you can still hear if you let your memory guide you. If you could step through that door, would those moments still unfold exactly as you remember? Or would your very presence, your being there again, change something small, and by changing it, alter everything that came after? This is where the imagination begins to stretch, because time is not only about clocks and calendars, it is about the delicate chain of causes, each linked to the next. And when you think of travelling backward, you begin to realise how fragile that chain may be. Philosophers have often pictured time like a line drawn across the ground. You walk forward, leaving your footprints behind. But what if you could turn around and step on the prints again? Would they remain the same, or would your new steps press them deeper, altering them, leaving behind a pattern that was never there before? The question may seem small, but from it grows some of the most puzzling paradoxes humans have ever thought about. For now, though, we will not hurry. We will rest on the idea itself, the quiet, unsettling idea that the past, which feels so solid and untouchable, might not be fixed at all. It is not hard to see why this thought has drawn so many minds across history. The idea of time travel appears in myths, in stories told long before the science of clocks and telescopes. Ancient cultures spoke of cycles, of great wheels of time turning back on themselves. Others imagined gods or spirits who could revisit the past, shaping destinies. Even now, when you close your eyes, you can drift into memory as if it were another place, and in a sense it is. But what separates memory from travel is touch. To step back and change even a single thing would be to interfere with the chain of causes that gave rise to who you are now. And that is why time travel is not only a dream but a puzzle. As you listen, let your thoughts drift gently through this idea. Imagine yourself not rushing, not leaping through flashing machines or dramatic portals, but simply walking quietly down a corridor where doors open into days long gone. You glance into one room and see yourself as a child. Another shows the world as it was years before you were born. The air is calm, the hall silent, but the feeling grows stronger the further you walk. If you reached out and touched even the smallest detail, what would happen? Would history bend? Would you yourself dissolve into nothing? Or would it all hold firm, unchanging, no matter what you did. This is the beginning of our slow journey into the paradox that has unsettled thinkers for decades. The grandfather paradox waits further along this corridor, but before we arrive at it, we must first sit with the thought of time itself unfolding in both directions, patient, steady, and mysterious. Because only when you have felt the weight of the past, the strangeness of stepping into it, can the paradox fully reveal its meaning. And so we will move gently, step by step, deeper into the puzzle, letting each thought carry us forward, though in this case perhaps it is more fitting to say backward. And as you imagine yourself walking quietly through that long corridor of time, doors opening into days that once were, the question slowly takes shape. A question that is simple to ask but impossible to answer. If you step back far enough, not just into your own life but into the lives that came before you, what would happen if you changed something essential? Imagine standing in the time when your grandfather was still young, before he had children, before the chain of events that would one day lead to you had even begun. You are there, present in his world, breathing the same air, watching him move through his own life, unaware of what is to come. Perhaps you see him in a quiet town walking home from work or sitting at a wooden table, speaking to friends, unaware that the smallest of his choices will ripple outward through time. Every step he takes, every word he says, becomes a tiny link in the chain that stretches forward, carrying the possibility of your existence. And then the thought rises, quiet but powerful. What if you did something that prevented him from ever having children? What if, by some action, small or large, you erased the possibility of your parents' birth and in turn erased yourself? At first it seems like an ordinary thought experiment, something to puzzle over and then set aside. But the longer you sit with it, the more unsettling it becomes. If you erase your own existence, then how could you have been there in the first place? The act cancels the possibility of itself, and yet, if you were never there, then your grandfather's life would go on untouched, your parent would be born, and eventually you would come to exist. With your existence restored, the possibility of travelling back returns once again, and so the loop begins, spinning endlessly, never breaking, never resolving. You trace this circle in your mind as if walking around it slowly, and each time you return to the beginning, it feels heavier, as though the thought itself resists conclusion. It is like being caught between two mirrors facing one another, each reflection repeating into the distance without ever arriving at a final image. The paradox reveals something fragile about the way we think of time. It shows how easily the thread of cause and effect can tangle itself, how logic itself can bend when forced into impossible conditions. The moment you try to picture the outcome, the ground slips away, because both possibilities cannot exist, and yet neither can be denied. You find yourself suspended between two states, one in which you are alive, one in which you are not, both depending entirely on each other. This gentle contradiction rests on something so simple, yet its simplicity is what makes it so profound. The paradox does not need grand machines or distant galaxies. It rests on a family, a grandfather, a parent, and a child. It turns something familiar into a puzzle that stretches the limits of reason. The more you consider it, the more you begin to see that the paradox is not really about your grandfather, nor even about time travel itself. It is about existence, about the fragile sequence of events that allowed you to be here, listening, breathing, aware. When you picture standing in that past moment, the weight of it grows. You see your presence there as something impossible, like a thread that does not belong in the tapestry, and yet there it is, woven in. To touch it, to pull on it even slightly, might unravel the entire pattern, and yet the paradox insists on being imagined, and in imagining it, you cannot help but wonder about the foundations of your own being. The circle continues to draw you in, folding back on itself with quiet persistence. If you were born, you can go back. But if you go back, you erase your birth, and if you erase your birth, you can never go back. Round and round it turns, not as a riddle to be solved, but as a rhythm, steady and unbroken, carrying you further into the mystery of what it means for time, and for you, to exist at all. The circle grows tighter the longer you follow it, as if each step only leads you back to where you began, but with a heavier weight pressing against your thoughts. The shape of it is simple, almost childlike in its design, and yet when you let it settle in your mind, it begins to bend reason in ways that are hard to escape. If you do not exist, then you cannot travel back, because there is no you to make the choice, no mind to imagine the journey, no body to step into the past. Without the journey, the past remains untouched. Your grandfather lives his ordinary life, perhaps never sensing how delicate his future really is, perhaps never knowing that in the chain of the years ahead, the possibility of you depends entirely on him. He marries, or perhaps he does not. He has children, or perhaps he waits until a later time. The details blur, but the result is the same. Somewhere down the line, your parent is born, and eventually so are you. And with your existence restored, so too is the possibility of returning to that past, the possibility of interfering again. You stand once more at the threshold, able to erase the very conditions that made your journey possible. This is where the loop begins to press more firmly. It is not a line that moves forward, nor a circle that turns gracefully. It feels more like a knot tightening, a place where logic ties itself so tightly that no matter how you pull, the rope only binds harder. If you remove your existence, you remove the act that caused it. But if you preserve your existence, you preserve the act that removes it. The mind tries to find escape routes. Perhaps you exist only temporarily. Perhaps there is some hidden rule that will untangle the knot. But the paradox allows none. It insists on its own rhythm, one state collapsing into the other, only to rebuild itself again. It is like standing on a bridge that vanishes under your feet even as you walk across it, yet reappears just in time to carry you another step. You are both supported and lost, both real and unreal, depending entirely on where you stand in the loop. The strangeness deepens the more you let it linger. Imagine yourself sitting with the thoughts slowly, not rushing toward an answer, but letting each turn of the circle breathe. In one image, you see yourself fading, your body never born, your memories never formed, your place in the world erased as if you had never been. But from this erasure comes the space for life to continue as it once did, for your grandfather's line to unfold untouched, for your parent to be born, and in time for you to take shape again. From non-existence flows existence, and from existence flows non-existence. It becomes a rhythm, like a pendulum swinging, not between left and right, but between being and not being. Each swing completes the last. Each return begins again, and there is no final resting place, no point at which the motion stills. The more carefully you imagine it, the more you notice how this paradox unsettles not only the rules of time, but the rules of identity. What does it mean for you to exist if your existence depends on your own absence? What does it mean to be a person if you can only take shape in a chain of events that you yourself have broken? It becomes clear that the grandfather paradox is not only about cause and effect, not only about the laws of physics, but about what it means to say the word I. You feel the tension of it like a soft vibration under every thought. If you are, then you are not. And if you are not, then you are. The two states rely on each other in a way that no answer can resolve. It is not a riddle to be solved, but a mirror held up to existence, showing that the line between presence and absence is far more delicate than it appears. The loop carries you further, not with noise or drama, but with a steady persistence, like waves rolling endlessly onto a shore. Each wave erases what came before, but in erasing it, makes space for the next to arrive. And so you drift with it, round and round, never reaching the end because the paradox itself is the end. Long before anyone spoke of paradoxes or imagined machines that could step across centuries, human beings were already trying to understand what time was. They looked at the rising and setting of the sun, the turning of the seasons, the rhythm of life and death, and they shaped stories that gave order to these endless changes. In many ancient cultures, time was not thought of as a straight line moving from beginning to end, but as a great circle endlessly repeating. The Egyptians watched the Nile rise and fall each year, flooding the land and then retreating, bringing life and then waiting for its return. And in this they saw time as a cycle of renewal, never ending, without a final conclusion. The Mayans carved their calendars in stone, cycles within cycles, each one turning into the next, their understanding of time woven into the heavens and the earth alike. In Greece, early philosophers wondered whether time was an eternal flow, or whether it had a beginning, a birth from chaos into order. Heraclitus spoke of change, of how nothing remains the same, how you cannot step into the same river twice, for both you and the river are already different. For him, time was movement, transformation, fire always burning, never still. Yet others, like Parmenides, saw time as illusion, believing that true reality was unchanging, timeless, beyond the flow of moments. Between these two ways of seeing, people tried to hold on to meaning, wondering whether the past and future were as real as the present, or whether only this single instant could be said to exist. In the East, thinkers in India imagined time as vast cycles of creation and destruction, ages that rose and fell like breaths of the universe itself. The wheel of samsara, the endless turning of birth and rebirth, was another way of saying that time never stops, but continues to circle back upon itself, trapping life until release is found. The Chinese spoke of harmony with the cycles of heaven and earth, yin and yang, the constant balancing of opposites, each flowing into the other, just as day becomes night and night becomes day again. For them, time was not only a measure, but a rhythm of existence, an endless tide that could not be resisted. And so, across lands and centuries, the idea of cycles became a way to explain the mystery of why everything changes, yet everything also returns. Even in myth, the gods themselves were often bound by time, sometimes powerless against its turning. The Greek titan Kronos was not just a god of time, but time itself, devouring his children so that none could escape the destiny he set. In Norse stories, the end of the world, Ragnarok, was not a true ending, but a renewal, a death that promised another beginning, another world rising from the ashes. Fate and time were often seen as intertwined, each moment guided by forces larger than any one person, as if the course of life were already written in the stars above. This sense of inevitability gave comfort to some, but unease to others, because if time is only a cycle, then perhaps nothing we do is truly free. Through all of these ideas, you can feel the calm persistence of human beings trying to make sense of the hours and days that carried them forward. Without clocks or physics, they looked at the sky, the soil, the turning of seasons, and they saw patterns repeating. Time was not only something to measure, but something to live with, something that shaped the rhythm of existence. These early thoughts remind us that time has always been a mystery, not an answer, and that the way we imagine it changes the way we understand ourselves. Just as the ancients saw cycles and fate in the movements of the world around them, so too do we continue to wonder whether time is a straight path or a circle, whether it is a line that ends or a wheel that never stops turning. And in that wondering, the roots of paradox quietly take hold. When you think of time, one of the first questions to arise is whether it stretches forward in a straight line, or whether it turns endlessly like a circle. A line suggests movement, a clear direction, a past that lies behind and a future that lies ahead, each moment new and unrepeatable. This is the way many of us naturally imagine our lives, as a journey from birth to death, each step taking us further from where we began and closer to where we will end. A line gives order to history, marking beginnings, middles, and endings, helping us place events in a sequence that feels stable. You are born at a particular moment, you grow older as years pass, and eventually your story will reach its conclusion. In this way, a line feels both natural and inevitable. Yet a circle tells a different story. A circle has no beginning and no end, only repetition, each turn bringing you back to where you started, each cycle repeating the last. In a circle, events return again and again, familiar, recurring, woven into a pattern that never truly leaves. The sunrise each morning, the phases of the moon, the seasons turning with steady patience. These are reminders that life itself often moves in cycles, returning to what once was, even as it feels new again. Both shapes describe time in different ways, and each carries its own kind of comfort and unease. In the linear view, your life is unique, your choices are singular, and once a moment has passed, it is gone forever. The day you lived yesterday will never return. The words you spoke cannot be unsaid. The opportunities missed cannot be reclaimed. Time moves forward, carrying everything with it, and in that forward movement there is both progress and loss. The arrow of time gives meaning to growth, to memory, to history, but it also ensures that what is gone cannot be restored. In the cyclical view, nothing is ever truly lost. The seasons return, the sun rises and sets, lives are born and ended, but always the wheel turns again. What vanishes in one moment may return in another, and the flow of time is not a path that ends but a rhythm that repeats. This way of seeing can be reassuring, for it suggests that nothing is final, that endings are only beginnings in disguise. Yet it can also feel unsettling, for if everything repeats, then perhaps nothing ever changes, and freedom becomes an illusion. Imagine the difference between walking a long road that stretches into the horizon and walking a path around a mountain where every step eventually brings you back to where you began. On the road, you leave things behind forever. On the circle, you meet them again, sometimes unchanged, sometimes altered by the turn-in. The two shapes lead to very different feelings about life. On the line, urgency grows, for there is only one chance, one passing of each moment. On the circle, patience takes root, for what departs may someday return. Both views can be found throughout history. The rise of modern science gave strength to the idea of linear time, with history as a timeline, the universe as something that began and will one day end. Calendars, records, and clocks all point in one direction, helping us mark the past, measure the present, and anticipate the future. But older traditions often lean towards cycles, seeing life and time as endless turning, without beginning or end. Farmers relied on the returning seasons, spiritual teachers spoke of reincarnation, and myths described ages that rose and fell, only to rise again. The truth may be that both shapes capture something real. To you, each moment feels linear, each day passing into the next, carrying you forward, and yet nature moves in cycles around you. The planets orbit, the seasons turn, the rhythms of sleep and waking repeat endlessly. Perhaps time is not only a line or only a circle, but a blending of both. A line drawn upon a wheel, carrying you forward even as patterns return. When you sit quietly with this thought, you begin to notice how both views influence the way you feel about existence. If life is a line, then every decision matters, because once a moment passes, it is gone forever. If life is a circle, then perhaps the pressure softens, because what is lost may one day return, and every ending holds the promise of renewal. And if both are true, then perhaps time is stranger still, a path that winds forward, while still turning back upon itself, an arrow that also bends into a loop. Between these two shapes lies the space where paradoxes grow, because the line and the circle pull against each other, each suggesting a different truth about what time really is. And it is in that tension, between forward movement and endless return, that the possibility of travelling back begins to take on its strange, impossible weight. In the 20th century, as science advanced and philosophy continued to untangle the mysteries of time, the grandfather paradox found its way into more serious conversations. Time travel was no longer only the subject of myths or stories told for wonder. It became a question examined by those who studied the very structure of reality. Physicists began to imagine what might happen if the equations that describe the universe were taken to their extreme, if bending space and time could truly allow one to step backwards instead of forwards. Philosophers too began to ask not only whether such a thing could be possible, but what it would mean if it were. Among them was David Lewis, a thinker who approached the paradox with calm clarity, speaking not with excitement, but with a steady patience that matched the rhythm of the problem itself. He suggested that perhaps the contradiction lies not in the act of travelling back, but in the way we imagine what can or cannot be changed. For Lewis, the past is fixed, and if you were to travel back, you would never be able to alter the events that gave rise to your own existence. You might stand in the past, you might even meet your grandfather, but you would find that every action you take is already woven into the fabric of history. In this way, the paradox softens not by being solved, but by showing that change may never have been truly possible in the first place, because the past once lived is already set in stone. Other philosophers circled around similar thoughts, each one adding another layer to the discussion. Some wondered whether free will and time travel could coexist at all, or whether the very idea of choice dissolves once you step into the past. Could you really prevent your grandfather from having children, or would circumstances always rise up to block you, as if time itself resisted contradiction? Imagine raising your hand to stop him from entering a room, only for the floor to creak at just the wrong moment, distracting you long enough for him to slip past. Imagine trying to speak words that could change his future, but finding your voice caught in your throat. These are not just accidents, they become necessities, because for you to exist, the chain of events cannot break. Time, in this view, is not simply a stage on which events unfold, but a force that shapes the events themselves to keep the story intact. Physicists began to explore similar ideas through the mathematics of relativity. Einstein's theories revealed that space and time are not separate but bound together, curving under the weight of mass and energy. Out of this came strange solutions, wormholes, bridges through space-time, and closed time-like curves, paths that circle back upon themselves. These solutions suggested that travelling into the past might not be entirely impossible, at least in theory. Yet each possibility carried the shadow of paradox. If you could step through a wormhole into yesterday, what would happen if you interfered with even the smallest event? Could the universe allow contradiction, or would it bend in some way to avoid it? Physicists like Igor Novikov proposed what became known as the principle of self-consistency, the idea that the universe prevents paradox by ensuring that anything you do in the past was always part of history. In this way, you might travel back, you might act, but you would never truly change the course of events. You could visit your grandfather, but you could not stop the chain of actions that led to your own existence. As these ideas spread, the grandfather paradox became a meeting ground where imagination and science touched. It appeared in the careful writings of philosophers, in the thought experiments of physicists, and in the stories told by novelists and filmmakers who gave it shape in worlds of fiction. But whether in a laboratory, a lecture hall, or a story, the central question remained stubbornly the same. If you go back, you undo yourself, and if you undo yourself, how did you go back at all? Each attempt to answer led only to new questions, and each new question revealed how fragile our understanding of time truly is. The paradox was not solved, but it grew, becoming a mirror for our curiosity and a reminder of our limits. Even with modern theories, careful reasoning, and advanced mathematics, time still resisted being pinned down, as if it carried within it a mystery that no amount of knowledge could erase. And so the 20th century left us not with clarity, but with a deeper sense of wonder, standing before the same riddle the ancients once felt, though now dressed in the language of science, still whispering the same quiet question. What does it mean to move against the current of time, and what happens if you try? One way that modern thinkers have tried to soften the knot of the grandfather paradox is by imagining that time does not collapse under contradiction, but instead divides, branching like a tree. In this view, when you travel back and act against the chain of events that led to your birth, the universe does not erase itself or cancel your existence, but simply creates another path, a parallel line of reality unfolding beside the one you came from. Imagine it gently, not as a violent split with sparks and noise, but as a quiet unfolding. The way a river sometimes divides around an island, one current carrying forward as it always did, the other bending into a new course. In one branch, your grandfather lives, your parent is born, and eventually so are you. And that is the branch that carried you into the time machine, into the act of going back. But in the other branch, the one shaped by your interference, the chain is broken, your parent is never born, and you do not exist. The two realities stand side by side, one where you continue, one where you vanish, and neither erases the other. Instead, both persist, each as real as the other, each complete in its own way, unfolding with their own futures. This idea, often called the many worlds view, transforms the paradox into something less impossible and more mysterious. Instead of a loop that traps logic in an endless circle, you find a branching of possibilities, each one free to unfold without destroying the others. It means that when you act in the past, you're not undoing your own existence, but creating a new reality in which your existence is no longer possible. A world where your footsteps never appear, your voice is never heard, your name is never spoken. Yet in your own original line, the one that carried you there, you still remain untouched because your past has not been undone, only duplicated into another form. Some find this comforting, for it allows contradiction to exist without collapse, a way for the universe to contain both outcomes. Others find it unsettling, for it suggests that every choice, every possibility, every moment of hesitation creates another world, another timeline where different outcomes play out endlessly, and each version is just as real as the one you know now. To think of it this way is to imagine the universe as not a single story, but an endless library of stories, each volume opening to a world that might have been, each shelf stretching beyond what can be counted, each hallway leading into another possibility where events unfold differently but no less fully. The thought grows heavier the longer you hold it, for it means that even the smallest decision could give rise to another reality, another you, walking a path you did not take. If you pause here, you might picture the countless branches reaching outward in all directions, a forest of possibilities with no end, each branch splitting again and again, each one holding a different version of events. One where you chose a different word in a conversation, one where you walked through a different door, one where your life unfolded along entirely different lines, and one where you were never even born at all. Each possibility is realized, none erased, and in this endless branching the paradox finds a home where it no longer loops in on itself, but simply spreads outward into alternatives. The comfort lies in the idea that contradictions no longer cancel each other out, but are instead absorbed by the universe's infinite capacity to divide, to create another world to hold each outcome. But this comfort carries its own unease, because if there are infinite branches, infinite versions of you, then which one is truly you? Are you the version who stands here now, breathing and listening and wondering, or are you only one leaf among countless leaves on the great tree of reality? If each version is as real as the others, then perhaps individuality itself is less certain than it feels, and what you call your life is simply one unfolding among many, neither more nor less important than the rest. The paradox softens here, but it does not vanish. It becomes instead a reflection on identity, on choice, on the nature of reality itself, showing that your existence and your non-existence may stand side by side, not locked in a single contradiction, but spread across the silence of parallel lines, each one as real and endless as the others, all of them flowing onward into futures you can never fully see. The idea of parallel universes finds one of its strongest footholds in the strange world of quantum mechanics, the branch of physics that describes reality at its smallest scales, where particles behave less like solid objects and more like clouds of possibilities. At this level, certainty seems to dissolve, and instead of clear outcomes, there are only chances, only probabilities waiting to be realized. A particle might be here, or it might be there, and it is only when observed that it seems to choose. To make sense of this, some physicists proposed the many worlds interpretation, a calm yet radical way of saying that the particle does not choose at all. Instead, every possible outcome happens, each in its own branch of reality. When a coin is flipped, in one universe it lands heads, in another it lands tails, and in yet another it may spin indefinitely before toppling to one side. Each branch exists alongside the others, equally real, equally complete, though you only ever perceive the one you're part of. Applied to time travel, this interpretation transforms the paradox of erasing your own existence into a branching of worlds, one where you act to prevent your grandfather's children, one where you do not, one where countless small variations ripple outward into futures that grow more and more distinct with every passing second. In this way, the contradiction dissolves, because your existence is not undone but duplicated into different outcomes, each housed in its own universe, each carrying forward with its own version of events. The thought of infinite branches stretches the mind, because it suggests that reality is far larger and more complex than anything we can directly see. Every choice you make, every hesitation, every decision not taken may unfold into another world where the opposite occurred. There is a version of you who turned left instead of right, a version who spoke instead of staying silent, a version who never came to exist because the chain of events stopped before reaching you. Each one is as real as the world you know, yet invisible to you, hidden behind the veil of your own path. To imagine this calmly, is to see the universe not as a single river, but as a vast delta. Currents dividing endlessly, flowing in every direction, carrying with them the weight of possibility. Some physicists describe it as a tree that never stops growing, each branch splitting again and again, each twig holding another world. Others compare it to waves, constantly spreading out from the smallest ripple, overlapping yet never cancelling. For the grandfather paradox, this means that the loop no longer traps logic in an impossible circle. Instead, when you travel back, the universe simply adds another branch to its endless tree. A place where your choice unfolds without undoing the world you left. You cannot destroy your own path, you can only create a new one. A world in which you never existed, running parallel to the one where you did. Some find this picture peaceful, because it allows contradiction to exist without breaking the structure of reality. Others find it haunting, because it suggests that everything that could happen does happen somewhere, in some branch, carried away into infinity. Imagine for a moment that with every breath you take, with every word you speak, reality divides silently, invisibly, producing new versions of you walking paths you will never see. The scale of it is impossible to grasp, because the branching never ends, not only in grand decisions but in the smallest moments. A blink, a step, the flutter of a thought. All of them unfold, all of them complete, each carrying a different version of the story. And as you let the thought settle, it feels less like an answer and more like a widening of the mystery, a reminder that time and reality may hold more paths than one mind could ever walk, and that within those countless paths, both your existence and your non-existence are always waiting, held in the silence of endless possibility. Another way of approaching the grandfather paradox is through the idea of what physicists call a closed time loop, or more gently, a self-consistent loop. Instead of imagining time splitting into countless branches where every possibility plays out, this view imagines time as a single unbroken thread, bending back on itself in such a way that every event, past and future, is already woven into the same pattern. In this picture, if you travel back in time, the things you do there are not disruptions or contradictions, but parts of the history that was always meant to be. You might believe you are changing something, but in truth you are only fulfilling a role that history has already accounted for. Imagine walking in a forest, where you suddenly find your own footprints ahead of you on the trail. You might think you are leaving new marks, but as you place your feet down, you realize they align perfectly with the ones already there. This is what a self-consistent loop suggests, that your actions in the past are already built into the past, and so the paradox of undoing yourself never truly arises. If you were to travel back and meet your grandfather, every word you said, every movement you made, would have already been part of his story long before you were born. If you believe you're about to prevent his children from being born, something will always happen to keep the chain intact. Not because fate intervenes, but because history has no gaps. Physicist Igor Novikov spoke of this as the principle of self-consistency, the idea that the universe prevents paradoxes not by forbidding time travel, but by ensuring that anything which occurs is already compatible with the history that exists. In this way, time is less fragile than it appears. It bends, it curves, it loops back upon itself, but it never breaks. The loop becomes a circle that supports itself, every cause leading to its effect, every effect feeding back into its cause. To imagine this is to see time not as something open to change, but as something whole and complete, a story that may twist but never contradicts itself. For the traveller, this means that what feels like freedom is always constrained. You can act, you can move, you can speak, but every choice you make will fold seamlessly into the history that led you there. You might even become the reason your grandfather lived, rather than the reason he did not. What feels like interference may instead be preservation, and what feels like change may only be the fulfillment of what was already true. To rest with this idea is to feel a strange calm, as though the puzzle no longer tears at itself, but closes neatly into a loop that sustains its own order. The knot of the paradox loosens, not because the question is solved, but because it is revealed to be impossible in the first place. You cannot undo yourself because the very act of going back was always written into the story. You may feel the illusion of possibility, the sense that you could do otherwise, but the loop ensures that only the consistent outcome can occur. Some find this comforting because it means that history is safe, unbreakable, incapable of unravelling under contradiction. Others find it unsettling because it suggests that free will itself dissolves once you step into the past, that your choices were never really choices at all, but only steps already taken, played out as if by memory rather than decision. Yet whether comforting or troubling, the self-consistent loop carries its own quiet beauty, because it shows that even the strangest journeys can still be held gently within the unbroken fabric of time, and that every action you imagine yourself taking may already be waiting for you in the past, written into history long before you ever dreamed of travelling back. Over the years, countless writers, philosophers and scientists have turned to stories and thought experiments to give shape to the mysteries of time travel, each one adding another thread to the long fabric of the paradox. One of the most famous examples comes from science fiction, where authors often imagined characters stepping into the past only to discover that their very attempt to change events ensures that those events unfold exactly as they were meant to. In Robert Heinlein's story, By His Bootstraps, a man is pulled into a loop where he meets different versions of himself, each one fulfilling a role that at first seems confusing, but later reveals itself to be necessary. He believes he has choices, but every action he takes is the one that was always taken, the loop closing neatly upon itself, a closed circle where freedom dissolves into inevitability. This story echoes the self-consistency idea, showing how the past bends to include the traveller's presence, not resist it. Another well-known tale is Ray Bradbury's A Sound of Thunder, where the act of stepping on a butterfly millions of years ago ripples forward to alter the present in dramatic ways. Here, the paradox is not about undoing one's own existence, but about the fragility of history itself, how even the smallest change in the past can magnify into vast differences in the future. The butterfly effect, as it came to be called, reminds us of the delicate interconnectedness of events, and how tampering with the past may not erase you, but may reshape everything you know, every word spoken, every law written, every familiar detail of daily life transformed by the quiet crushing of wings beneath a boot. In philosophy, similar thought experiments have been posed without the embellishment of fiction, but with the same unsettling implications. Imagine a man who travels back and hands Shakespeare a copy of Hamlet before Shakespeare ever wrote it. Shakespeare then publishes the play, but the time traveller only knew Hamlet because it already existed. Who then truly wrote it? This is known as a causal loop, where an object or idea exists without a true origin, passed endlessly between past and future without ever being created. It does not directly erase existence like the grandfather paradox, but it dissolves the very notion of cause and effect, leaving us with something uncomfortably suspended between invention and memory. Scientists, too, have entertained such puzzles when testing the boundaries of relativity and quantum mechanics. Some described imaginary machines, closed time-like curves, wormholes stabilized with exotic matter, that could allow information to travel backward, raising the question of whether knowledge itself could create paradoxes. Could you send a message back to prevent yourself from ever building the machine? If the message arrives, then you never build it. But if you never build it, the message cannot be sent. The loop folds in on itself like an endless whisper, knowledge existing without a beginning, carried forward and backward in time without a clear point of origin. These stories and thought experiments, whether written as fiction or framed as careful philosophy, serve the same purpose. They invite the mind to step carefully into the impossible, to feel the tension of a world where time does not obey the rules we rely on. They are not meant to provide answers, but to reveal how fragile our sense of logic becomes when confronted with the possibility of moving backward. And as you listen, you may notice how each story, no matter how different, circles back to the same quiet unease, the sense that time, once touched, does not behave as we expect, and that the paradox is not only a puzzle of science, but a mirror held up to the very nature of existence itself. When you sit with these thought experiments, the paradox begins to move from the mechanics of time into something far more personal, because it is no longer only about history or physics, but about memory and identity, about the question of what it means to be you. If the past can be changed or erased, then what becomes of the memories that rest within you, the countless small details that tell you who you are? Imagine for a moment that you travelled back and removed a single event from your family line, perhaps preventing your grandfather from ever meeting your grandmother. If that bond never formed, then your parent would not be born, and you would not either. But before that unravelling takes hold, you still stand there in the past, filled with memories of a life that depended on that meeting, memories of people who no longer exist, memories of a childhood that never happened. Those memories become weightless, like smoke rising in a room with no ceiling, because without the past that gave birth to them, they no longer have ground to rest on. You're left with a strange contradiction. You remember what never happened. You carry experiences from a world that no longer exists, and yet those experiences are the only thing holding together your sense of self. This is where the paradox reaches into identity, because who you are is not only your body, but the chain of experiences that shaped you. If those experiences are undone, are you still you? If your memories point to a past that no longer exists, are they memories at all, or are they fictions born from a timeline that has been erased? Even without time travel, the question is unsettling. Memory is fragile, always shifting, often unreliable, yet it is the anchor of self. You know yourself because you remember, and you remember because of the life you lived. But if the past can change, the anchor begins to drift, and the very idea of identity loosens. The grandfather paradox, then, is not only about the impossibility of existence, but about the impossibility of a self that has no history. To imagine being erased from the timeline is also to imagine your memories dissolving, your sense of continuity breaking apart like a thread pulled loose from a fabric until nothing remains. And yet, there is a strange persistence in the thought of memory itself, because even as you imagine being erased, you cannot help but remember. Your mind still holds the story, even if the world no longer does. You become a ghost of a life that is gone, a witness to events no longer written into history. This makes the paradox heavier, because it is no longer only about whether you exist, but whether you can still claim to have been. If time unravels the past, what happens to the person who remembers it? Do they vanish entirely, or do they drift outside of history, holding fragments of a life that never was? These questions do not offer answers, but they reveal how deeply the paradox touches not only the universe, but the fragile concept of self, and how identity, memory, and time are tied so closely together that to change one is to threaten them all. To think calmly about this is to realize that your very sense of continuity rests on a fragile trust, that the past you remember truly happened, that it cannot slip away or be rewritten. If that trust breaks, then the self breaks with it. You are not just your body in this moment, but the long shadow of experiences, choices, loves and losses behind you. Without them, what remains is something hollow, a presence without a past, a name without a story. And in this way, the grandfather paradox does not only ask about the survival of history, it asks about the survival of identity itself. Because without memory, there is no you, and without you, there is no paradox at all, only silence where a life once was. Across culture, the grandfather paradox has appeared again and again, not only in philosophy or science, but in stories, films and myths, because it offers a natural way to explore the fragility of time and the uncertainty of existence. Writers and filmmakers often turn to it when they want to show how delicate the past really is, how even the smallest change can ripple outward to reshape the present in strange and unexpected ways, and how identity itself becomes fragile once you imagine altering the conditions that gave rise to your life. In cinema, one of the most famous examples is the Back to the Future series, where Marty McFly accidentally interferes with a meeting of his parents, threatening his own existence as the photograph of his family begins to fade. The tension in the story comes not from monsters or disasters, but from the possibility that his own life might unravel if he cannot restore the events that led to him being born, showing how the paradox can create suspense without explosions or battles, simply through the quiet fear of being erased. In other films like The Terminator, the paradox is twisted into a story of survival, where a man is sent back to protect a woman, only to become the father of the very child he was meant to defend. Here the loop folds in on itself, creating a world where cause and effect chase each other endlessly, and the audience is left to wonder whether the future shapes the past or the past shapes the future. The paradox becomes not a puzzle to solve, but a dramatic force, shaping the destiny of characters who may not even realize that they are trapped inside a loop. Books have long explored the paradox in quieter, more reflective ways, often using it as a tool to ask deeper questions about fate, choice, and responsibility. In science fiction literature, authors like Robert Heinlein, Ray Bradbury, and Ursula K. Le Guin imagined characters who stepped into the past only to discover that their actions were part of a cycle they could not escape. Bradbury's A Sound of Thunder gave us the butterfly effect, where stepping on a single insect millions of years ago reshaped the entire future, a metaphor for the way every detail of life is connected. Other stories, like Heinlein's By His Bootstraps or All You Zombies, showed characters meeting versions of themselves, tangled in loops where their own choices created the conditions for those choices to exist. An endless circle of identity folding back upon itself. In these works, the paradox becomes a mirror for the human condition, suggesting that perhaps all of us are caught in patterns larger than we can see, where our sense of freedom is only another turn of the wheel. Even older myths carry echoes of the paradox, though told in the language of gods and fate rather than physics. In Greek mythology, characters who tried to escape prophecy often fulfilled it instead, trapped in loops that mirrored the logic of the paradox. Oedipus, trying to avoid the fate of killing his father, only found himself walking the path that led directly to it. In Norse mythology, Ragnarok was not a single apocalypse, but a cycle of destruction and renewal, a fate that even the gods could not resist, where the end was always already written. Folktales from many cultures tell of people who tried to change destiny, only to become the very cause of the events they wished to prevent. These stories reveal that the human fascination with time and paradox is ancient, long before the equations of relativity or the theories of quantum mechanics. The same unease and wonder stirred in myth as stirs now in science fiction. The recognition that to fight against time is to become more deeply caught in its weave. Through these cultural expressions, the grandfather paradox becomes more than an abstract riddle. It becomes a living story, one that touches people across generations. Films make it vivid, books make it thoughtful, myths make it timeless, and together they show how the paradox is not only about logic, but about the deep human desire to touch the past and the deep fear of what might happen if we succeed. By placing the paradox in culture, storytellers turn it into something we can feel, something we can imagine not as a dry puzzle, but as a lived experience, where love, loss, and identity are placed on the line. Each story, whether told in a theatre, written in a book, or whispered as myth, reminds us that time is both fragile and unyielding, and that when we imagine touching it, we cannot help but imagine what would happen if it slipped away. The paradox thrives in culture because it speaks to something we all understand, that who we are depends on where we came from, and that to change the past is to risk losing ourselves entirely. A thought, both. Haunting and strangely beautiful, lingering long after the story ends. When the paradox shifts from science and story into philosophy, it begins to ask questions that reach deeper than physics, questions that touch the very foundation of self and identity. If time can split into branches or fold back into loops, then what does it mean for you to be you? Is identity something solid, fixed, and unchanging across all possible realities, or is it something fluid, something that shifts and reshapes itself with every possibility that unfolds? Imagine for a moment that the many worlds interpretation is true, and that every possible choice you could make creates another version of reality. In one world you live, in another you vanish, in another you grow up differently because your grandfather met someone else, or because history took another turn. In some worlds you exist in name only. In others, you're a stranger to yourself, moulded by circumstances so different from your own that you would not even recognize that person as you. And yet, in each of these worlds, there is still someone who occupies your place, someone who carries your shape in a different form. Which of those versions is truly you? If every possibility is realized somewhere, then identity itself cannot be a single line drawn through time, but something more like a constellation, scattered across countless skies, each star representing a different version of the self, all of them shining at once. To think of identity as fixed is to believe that no matter what happens, there is an essence that remains unbroken, a core that ties together every moment of your life. This is the belief that even across paradoxes and possibilities, there is something in you that endures, something that cannot be erased by circumstance. But to think of identity as fluid is to believe that the self is not permanent but constantly shifting, shaped by time, choice, and the events that surround it. If a small change in the past creates a different life, then perhaps it also creates a different self, one that feels just as real as the one who speaks and remembers now, but who is not the same person at all. The grandfather paradox presses hard against this question because it forces you to imagine two contradictory states. In one version of events you exist, and in another you do not, and yet both states are equally possible, both equally real. If you can be both present and absent, both alive and erased, then what does it mean to call yourself a single person? Philosophers have often wondered whether the self is an essence that persists through time, like a flame that continues to burn no matter how it flickers, or whether it is only a bundle of memories and experiences held together in the present moment, fragile and temporary. The paradox seems to lean toward the latter, because it shows how easily identity can be dissolved by changes to the past. If the chain of causes that produced you is broken, then the self that exists now evaporates as if it were never there. But in another sense, the paradox also suggests that the self is more resilient, because even in a world where you are erased, The memory of you persists in thought, in imagination, in the echo of what might have been. Identity then begins to look less like a fixed point and more like a story told by time, a story that can be retold differently each time the past is touched. And if identity is only a story, then the paradox reveals just how fragile that story really is. You think of yourself as continuous, as the same person who lived yesterday and the day before, but that continuity depends entirely on the past being stable. Change the past, and the story breaks, leaving you wondering whether the person who stands in your place tomorrow will still be you, or whether they will only carry fragments of who you once were. To think calmly about this is to see the self not as a permanent truth, but as a shifting pattern, always dependent on the conditions of time, always vulnerable to the currents of cause and effect. The grandfather paradox does not only ask about the survival of history, it asks about the survival of identity, and whether there is anything about you that could endure if the ground beneath memory and existence were pulled away. It leaves you with the unsettling possibility that perhaps the self is not a single presence at all, but a collection of possibilities, each one waiting in the silence of time, each one as real as the others, each one fragile in its own way. The grandfather paradox also invites us to consider the quiet but weighty question of determinism and free will, whether events are locked in place, or whether the choices we make truly have the power to bend the flow of time. Determinism is the idea that everything that happens is the inevitable result of what came before, like a chain that stretches endlessly backward, each link forged by the one before it. If this is true, then the present moment is simply the unfolding of causes set in motion long ago, and even your thoughts and choices are not truly free but the product of prior events, all the way down to the smallest detail. Within this view, time travel would not allow you to change history, because whatever you did in the past would already have been part of the past to begin with. If you were to attempt to stop your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, some detail, some coincidence, some slip of chance would prevent you, not by accident, but because the outcome has always been fixed. You might drop the tool you plan to use, you might be delayed at the last second, or events might twist in such a way that your grandfather still survives, and your existence still comes to be. This interpretation erases the paradox entirely, because your very attempt to alter the past becomes the proof that the past cannot be altered. Free will, on the other hand, offers a very different picture. It insists that our choices matter, that each decision we make opens a new possibility, and that time is not a closed chain but a path that can branch. If this is true, then travelling back in time would give you the power to genuinely alter the conditions that led to your existence. You might prevent a meeting, end a life, or nudge the past in such a way that your own birth no longer occurs. But this creates the paradox in its strongest form, because if you succeed in changing the past so that you're never born, then you could not have travelled back in the first place, which means you would not have been there to make the change. The contradiction lies at the very heart of the matter, making free will both the fuel of the paradox and the reason it becomes so difficult to resolve. Some thinkers have suggested that time protects itself, that even if free will exists in the ordinary sense, the past is insulated from true change. This is the principle of self-consistency, where you may act freely but your choices always fold back into history in ways that preserve the timeline. Others imagine that the exercise of free will splits reality itself, sending one version of events down one branch where you succeed and another where you fail, creating parallel streams of time where both outcomes remain valid. In this picture, determinism and free will coexist in a strange balance, with determinism binding each timeline internally, while free will scatters them into a vast multiverse. And yet, for the listener, the paradox remains a deeply human one. When you reflect on your own life, you wonder whether your choices are truly free, or whether they were written long before you made them. If you could go back and undo a single decision, would that really change who you are? Or was it always the case that you would arrive exactly where you stand now? The grandfather paradox pushes this question into sharper relief, not by offering an answer, but by holding both possibilities side by side, leaving you to drift between them. Perhaps you are the author of your own story, free to write and rewrite it even at the cost of erasing yourself. Or perhaps you are the character in a tale that has already been told, every word and turn already decided, with your sense of freedom only another detail in the script. To think about this calmly is to feel the weight of time not as an enemy, but as an unbroken current, carrying you forward whether you resist or not, leaving you to wonder whether you are swimming freely in its waters or simply being carried by the flow. When we move from philosophy into physics, the grandfather paradox takes on a new form, because scientists have long wondered not only about what the paradox means, but about whether time travel itself is even possible within the laws of nature. Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity opened the door to these questions, because it described time not as a rigid stage on which events unfold, but as part of a flexible fabric called space-time. In relativity, space and time are woven together, and mass and energy bend this fabric, creating the force we call gravity. This bending is not just a way to explain why planets move around stars, but also a way to imagine how the flow of time itself could be stretched, twisted, or even looped back on itself. If space-time can curve, then in principle it might also form shortcuts, paths that connect two distant points in space and time. One idea that emerged from this is the concept of a wormhole, sometimes called an Einstein-Rosen bridge, a tunnel through space-time that links two different places and perhaps two different times. If such a tunnel could exist and be stabilized, then stepping through one end might bring you not only to a distant part of the universe, but also into another era. Yet wormholes, while mathematically possible, are unstable, likely to collapse instantly unless held open by forms of matter that may or may not exist, often called exotic matter. Physicists debate whether such matter could ever be real, and even if it were, whether the universe would allow a wormhole to function as a time machine without breaking the rules of causality. Black holes are another doorway through which physicists have imagined time travel. A black hole bends space-time so intensely that not even light can escape it, and near its horizon time itself slows dramatically compared to a distant observer. This means that if you orbit close to a black hole and then return, you would have experienced time differently than those who remained far away, travelling into the future relative to them. This is not fantasy but a real consequence of relativity, something confirmed by experiments with precise clocks in strong gravitational fields. The past, however, is more elusive, and to step backward requires more than simply slowing time. Some solutions to Einstein's equations suggest the possibility of closed time-like curves, paths in space-time that circle back on themselves, allowing a traveller to return to their own past. These curves exist in certain theoretical models, such as those involving rapidly rotating universes or special configurations of energy, but whether they could exist in reality is deeply uncertain. Many physicists believe that the laws of physics protect against true backward travel, either by preventing the conditions needed to create such loops, or by enforcing consistency so that paradoxes cannot occur. Stephen Hawking even proposed what he called the chronology protection conjecture, the idea that the universe conspires to prevent time travel on a macroscopic scale, sealing off paradox before it begins. Still, the mathematics does not close the door entirely, and so the possibility lingers, half open, neither fully denied nor fully accepted. What is striking in all of this is how calmly the boundary between imagination and science blurs. A wormhole may sound like a device of myth, but it arises naturally from equations that describe the universe with extraordinary precision. A black hole may feel like a monster of fiction, but it has been observed in the skies, its shadow photographed, its pull measured. Physics does not tell us that time travel is simple or likely, but it does tell us that the structure of time is more flexible than common sense suggests. Even if the paradox cannot be resolved, the science shows us that the universe itself holds within it the seeds of mystery, that space-time is not a flat road, but a landscape full of folds, tunnels, and strange turns where the mind can wander. And so, the grandfather paradox rests uneasily here, not dismissed, not confirmed, but suspended in the quiet space between mathematics and possibility. A riddle waiting at the edge of physics, carried gently by the thought that the rules of the cosmos may be stranger and softer than they first appear, when physicists step beyond the solid ground of proven theory and into the softer terrain of speculation. The grandfather paradox becomes a lens through which they imagine what might be possible if the universe allowed stranger rules than the ones we know. One of the most common ideas here is exotic matter, a hypothetical substance with properties unlike anything we encounter in daily life. Unlike ordinary matter, which always has positive energy and mass, exotic matter would possess negative energy density, something that sounds almost impossible but appears in certain quantum effects. If such matter could be gathered in enough quantity, it might serve to stabilize wormholes, keeping their mouths open against the crushing force of gravity that would normally collapse them instantly. A stable wormhole would not only connect two distant points in space, but could, under the right conditions, connect two different points in time. The paradox arises here immediately because if such a bridge were possible, a traveller could move back into the past and face the puzzle of altering events that made their journey possible in the first place. Another speculation is the concept of closed time-like curves, strange paths predicted by some solutions to Einstein's equations. These curves are loops in space-time where, if you followed them, you would return not just to the same place, but to the same moment in time. It is as though the universe itself folded into a circle, creating a situation where cause and effect blur into one another. In models like Gödel's rotating universe or Tipler cylinders, closed time-like curves appear as possibilities, though they require extreme conditions such as an infinitely long rotating object or a cosmos that spins endlessly. These scenarios are beyond what we observe in the real universe, yet they show that the laws of relativity do not forbid time loops entirely, even if practical reality seems to resist them. Some scientists have wondered whether quantum mechanics, with its uncertainty and probabilities, might allow for even stranger forms of time travel when combined with relativity, creating situations where paradoxes are avoided by splitting outcomes or by adjusting probabilities to ensure consistency. Speculation stretches further still into ideas like tachyons, hypothetical particles that always move faster than light. If they existed, they would appear to travel backward in time relative to ordinary observers, potentially carrying signals or information into the past. But tachyons remain purely theoretical, and their existence may conflict with the stability of the universe itself. The paradox once again emerges as a quiet shadow, because sending even a message into the past creates the same logical loop. If the information changes events so that the message was never sent, then the paradox holds firm. Some researchers imagine that paradoxes might be resolved not by forbidding time travel, but by weaving consistency into the rules of the universe. This is the Novikov self-consistency principle, which proposes that if closed time-like curves exist, then only those actions are allowed which fit smoothly into history, preventing contradictions before they arise. In this vision, the paradox is avoided not by blocking time travel, but by ensuring that whatever you do in the past was always meant to happen, no matter how unexpected the path. The further one drifts into speculation, the more the boundary between science and philosophy begins to blur. Exotic matter, closed loops and faster-than-light particles may sound like dreams or stories, but they all emerge from the same quiet question. What does the universe permit? And how flexible is the fabric of time? If time is a rigid wall, then these ideas are fantasies. But if time is a pliant thread, then perhaps the cosmos holds stranger possibilities than we dare to believe. Each speculation does not so much answer the paradox as reshape it, creating new versions of the same puzzle in which existence hangs delicately on the rules of cause and effect. And in this gentle uncertainty, the grandfather paradox remains, whispering that even the boldest theories cannot untangle it fully, but only circle around it, like travellers following a path that always bends back to its beginning. When you step away from equations and theories and look inward, the grandfather paradox takes on another meaning, one tied not to physics, but to the quiet longings of human beings. The very reason the paradox captivates us is because it touches a deep and universal desire, the wish to return to the past and change it. Almost everyone has moments they would alter if given the chance, decisions they regret, words they wish had been spoken, or actions they wish had been undone. To think of time travel is not only to think of loops and contradictions, but to think of second chances, of paths not taken, of lives imagined but never lived. Regret is one of the most powerful emotions connected to time, because it ties the present to a memory of what might have been, a life just out of reach, an alternate version of events that feels so close and yet forever lost. To dream of going back is often to dream of undoing pain, of stepping in at the moment when everything began to go wrong and guiding it to a gentler outcome. It is the thought of stopping a mistake before it grows, of rescuing someone before loss takes them, of speaking a word of kindness before silence settles in forever. Love, too, is deeply woven into this longing, for time always moves away from the moments and people we wish we could hold close. A chance to return might mean one more conversation, one more embrace, one more chance to say the things that time carried too quickly away. It is not only regret that makes us wish to travel backward, but gratitude, the wish to relive beauty, to see again the faces and hear again the voices of those who are gone. At its heart, the fantasy of revisiting the past is not about control, but about connection, about reaching across the years to touch what has been lost. And yet, the paradox reminds us that such changes are not simple, because altering the past unravels the present. To save someone might mean erasing the conditions that brought you here. To undo one mistake might undo the very path of your life, and the self that dreams of change might vanish along with the pain it longs to erase. This is why the grandfather paradox resonates so strongly with human imagination, because it reflects not only the structure of time but also the delicate balance of memory, identity, and desire. We live with the knowledge that the past cannot be touched, and so our regrets remain as quiet shadows, our longings as gentle whispers, and our memories as the only bridge across what is gone. The paradox, in a way, gives form to these feelings, offering a story in which the dream of changing the past is possible, but at the same time showing the cost of such power. To travel backward is to risk unravelling the very self that longs for the change, to erase not only the mistake but also the person who carries it. And so the paradox is not only a puzzle of logic, but a reflection of human emotion, a reminder that our desire to revisit the past is both beautiful and dangerous, both comforting and unsettling. It speaks softly of how fragile life is, how each choice, each action, no matter how small, becomes part of who we are. Perhaps that is why people return to the idea again and again, not because they believe they will build a machine to step backward, but because the thought itself offers a space to imagine what might have been, to linger in the dream of possibilities, to wonder how different everything could look with just a single change. And in this wondering, the paradox becomes less about physics and more about the human heart, about the way we live with memory, regret, love, and the quiet acceptance that time in its steady flow carries us forward and never back. The grandfather paradox, when carried gently through all its twists and turns, begins to soften into something less like a riddle, demanding a sharp solution, and more like a reflection of how humans imagine time itself. At first it feels urgent, almost like a problem that must be fixed. How can someone both exist and not exist? How can an action in the past erase the very cause of its own existence? The mind circles this loop restlessly, seeking closure. But the longer you sit with it, the more you notice that the paradox does not tighten into an answer, but instead loosens, like a knot that unravels into many threads, each one leading to another question rather than a conclusion. Paradoxes in philosophy have always been this way. They are less about arriving somewhere and more about showing us the limits of the road we're on. They stand as signposts at the edge of thought, pointing beyond what reason can comfortably contain. The grandfather paradox is one of these signposts, not evidence of a broken universe, but evidence of the boundaries of human imagination, reminding us that time may not fit into the simple shapes we try to give it. To live with the paradox is to accept that our models of time are partial, that our desire to step backward and alter what has already passed is met not with certainty but with reflections, questions, and dreams. In this way, the paradox becomes less a trap and more a meditation. It teaches patience, because it cannot be forced into clarity, and it teaches humility, because it reveals how small our perspective is in the face of something as vast as time. Living with it means allowing it to exist without needing to tame it, to see it not as a wall, but as a mirror. It reflects back our longings, our regrets, our love of consistency, our need for stories that line up neatly. And yet life itself is not always neat. Memory slips, choices surprise us, chance steps in unexpectedly, and time continues regardless of whether the path feels straight or tangled. The paradox in this sense is simply a story we tell ourselves about the tension between past and present, between what has happened and what we wish could happen. It does not close the door on time travel nor open it fully, but instead keeps the doorway half ajar, a space for wondering, imagining, and drifting. To live with it is to understand that maybe not every mystery is meant to be solved, that some ideas exist to hold us in reflection rather than to deliver certainty. If we accept this, then the paradox becomes softer, less like a contradiction and more like a companion. It walks alongside us as we think about time, whispering that the past is near but unreachable, solid in memory but untouchable in reality. It reminds us that while our minds are free to wander backward, our lives move forward in a steady current, carrying us from one moment to the next, and perhaps there is a kind of peace in this. To accept the paradox is to stop fighting against the flow of time, to stop searching for a way to bend it to our will, and instead to rest in its quiet rhythm. Every paradox in human thought has carried this lesson in its own way, that the value lies not in the solution but in the journey of thinking, in the gentle pause it creates, in the way it opens space for us to reflect on what it means to exist at all. And so the grandfather paradox remains, not as a broken thread in the fabric of logic, but as a delicate pattern woven into the larger tapestry of human thought. It is not something to be solved once and for all, but something to live with, to revisit, to contemplate when the mind is quiet. It does not need to close, it only needs to be seen. And in that seeing, in that soft acceptance, It offers a reminder of the mysteries that lie at the heart of time, mysteries that do not demand answers but invite us instead to drift with them, calmly, as though floating in a river whose course we cannot change, but whose waters carry us all the same. As the long journey through the winding turns of the grandfather paradox begins to settle, it feels natural to return, slowly and gently, to the ground beneath your feet, to the place where you are in this present moment. We have wandered far into the territory of imagination, through ideas of parallel worlds, closed loops, and the deep longing of human hearts that wish to change what is gone, and yet now the path bends back, leading you softly into the here and now. For all the complexity of time, for all the contradictions that puzzle philosophers and physicists alike, there is one truth that does not shift. The present is the only place where life unfolds. The past lives only as memory, fragile, changing, coloured by how you recall it, and the future lives only as expectation, uncertain and always just beyond reach. But the present, this moment, is steady and quiet, offering itself to you without paradox. As you return to it, you may feel the difference between thinking of time as a puzzle and living in time as an experience. Thought loops and circles, chasing what-ifs and impossibilities, but the present flows simply, second by second, like the sound of a river you do not need to understand in order to hear. To return here is to realize that you're not lost in a loop, not caught in an impossible contradiction, but gently carried forward with each breath, each blink, each beat of your heart. The paradox itself becomes like a dream you can set aside, not forgotten, but softened. It no longer presses with urgency, but lingers like an echo, a reminder of how easily the mind drifts across centuries while the body rests in stillness. Here in the present, there is no contradiction, only continuity. You're the result of every moment that has come before, not undone by questions of possibility but shaped quietly by reality. You exist because time has flowed as it has, and you continue because it keeps flowing, always forward. There is comfort in knowing that the tangled loops belong to imagination, while your life is anchored here. The paradox reminds us of the limits of control, that we cannot go back and pull at the threads of the past without unweaving the present. But it also reminds us of the gift of being here, of how the present moment contains everything we have, everything we are. Returning here is a kind of acceptance, a soft recognition that the mysteries of time are not burdens to solve, but companions to reflect upon. So let yourself sink gently into this awareness. The air around you, the quiet hum of your thoughts, the weight of your body resting where it is. All of this belongs to the present. You're not in the past you cannot touch, nor in the future you cannot yet see. You're here in the flow of time as it moves through you. Returning to the present means understanding that every possibility you have imagined belongs not to what was or will be, but to the awareness you hold now. You cannot step back to stop your grandfather, nor step forward to see what is yet to come, but you can rest in this space where time does not ask you to solve it, only to live in it. The paradox still exists, as all paradoxes do, but it no longer unsettles. It drifts behind you like a fading sound, leaving in its place a calm reminder of the steady unfolding of now. And as you return more fully, you may notice how soft this moment is, how it holds you without question, without contradiction, without loops to chase. It is simply here, simply present, and in recognizing it, you too become more present, grounded not in what cannot be changed, but in what is quietly, steadily real. And as the present moment settles quietly around you, the paradox that once seemed so sharp now softens into the background, becoming less a puzzle and more a gentle reminder of the mystery of time itself. We have walked slowly through many paths, tracing the questions of loops that close upon themselves, of branches that split into countless possible worlds, of memories that hold us, and of choices we long to change, and each of these reflections has led us back here, to this moment, to the calm of being. The grandfather paradox has been less a problem to fix than a mirror held up to our thoughts, showing us how deeply humans long to understand, how we wish to master the currents of time, and how we are humbled when we realize that time will always flow beyond us. In this realization there is no defeat, only peace, for in seeing the limits of control we learn to rest in what is given. The paradox cannot be solved, not in the way a riddle can, because it was never meant to be solved. It was meant to invite us into reflection, into wonder, into the awareness that life is fragile and precious, because it could so easily have been otherwise. You're here now, not by certainty, but by the countless strands of chance and continuity that held together to bring you into being. Every small event in history, every decision, every moment of chance led to this present, and the paradox shows us that if even one of those threads had been altered, this moment might not exist at all. And yet it does. And because it does, it is extraordinary. The paradox shines a light on the delicacy of existence, not to frighten, but to remind us of how remarkable it is that we are here at all. It is easy to become caught in the thought of what might have been different, of what might have been prevented or undone, but the paradox teaches us that such paths belong to imagination, not to reality. The past is fixed, the future is yet to arrive, and the present is all that can be touched. To rest in the present is to free yourself from the loops of contradiction, to feel the quiet strength of what simply is. The air around you, the rhythm of your breath, the stillness of your body. All of this belongs to the now, and the now is enough. As the paradox fades into the distance, what remains is a calm awareness of time's mystery, a mystery that asks nothing of you but to drift with it. You do not need to control its flow, nor solve its riddles, nor chase its impossible paths. You only need to be carried, as you already are, forward into the next moment, and then the next, each one arriving quietly without demand. This is the gift of reflection, that it shows us the vastness of time, and then it sets us gently back into our place within it, small but steady, fragile but real. And so the grandfather paradox closes not with resolution but with silence, a silence that welcomes you to let go, to rest, to trust in the flow of life as it continues. The mind may wander, as it always does, but the body knows how to settle, how to drift, how to surrender to the rhythm of sleep. And so here, at the end of the story, you may feel the weight of time loosening, the urgency of questions fading, and the soft pull of rest beginning to take hold. The paradox remains, as all mysteries do, but it no longer troubles you. It drifts like a distant star, still shining but far away, while you rest beneath the quiet sky of now. You have walked through its paths, you have turned its questions in your hands, and now you can set it down, knowing that it will wait for you if you wish to return, but that for now, the present is all you need. And as your thoughts slow, as your eyes grow heavy, as your breath deepens, the paradox fades completely into silence, leaving only peace. You are here, alive in this moment, carried by time, safe within its endless flow. And in this awareness, you can let go at last, drifting into sleep, where the questions dissolve and only calm remains, carrying you gently into dreams where time itself becomes soft and endless.